Very much for having me today to discuss Sofia's excellent research here on prosecuting returnees from Syria and Iraq and France. So as Sofia mentioned, I will be talking primarily about those gender dimensions of the French response to date. So I'll talk briefly first about hopefully briefly about the analytic phases of the French response to female returnees, then the judicial strategy towards women, then the implications of this judicial strategy on justice and cooperation, and finally a point on future challenges. So the French response to female returnees can be understood largely as an evolution of the development or an evolution of the understanding of women's roles and status within Daesh, but not just. So we see two major shifts that took place regarding this response: the repatriation shift and a penal policy shift. Now, regarding the repatriation shift, until summer 2022, the French policy was not to return women and children from the camps in northeastern Syria. And due to a confluence of factors, namely the re-election of Emmanuel Macron, so the rejuvenated political will for what was initially an extremely unpopular policy of repatriation, and within that that context, also reframing of the security priority of repatriating women and children. There was the European Court of Human Rights ruling, which condemned France for its lapses in not taking care of, which is to say, in this case, returning again its citizens from northeast Syria, and the end of the state of emergency in France. So basically, the formalization of the penal and administrative measures that would allow France to deal with their citizens and the repatriation. These all came together, and in summer 2022, we saw a drastic shift then in the French policy. And today, to my knowledge, the women that want to return have been returned, but there are some people left, as we've discussed, and I'll just talk about that at the very end. Then in terms specifically of the penal policy, we've seen three, again, broadly analytical phases of the French response to women. So phase one is what Antoine Mégy calls the invisibility phase, if you will, which is effectively that and actually this is from Sharon's article on the ethnography of terrorism trials. What the French prosecutor's office said was that they were acting from a place of extreme naivete. They considered at that time that women had left to take care of their husbands and to have children and take care of their homes, and therefore that they did not pose any security threat. So this, there was an underpinned kind of paternalistic assumption about the inherent victimhood of women and the inherent submission or coercion of these women that went to join Daesh. And effectively, in 2015, following these catastrophic terror attacks in France, you saw a reckoning in France regarding, okay, why hadn't these attacks been foreseen or prevented? So you saw a reckoning with regard to how France was dealing with IS members, with Daesh members, and at the tail end of this, also in the context of the creation of the Cazeneuve Protocol, which basically allowed for cooperation between French and Turkish authorities to systematically investigate and arrest those French citizens leaving Syria. You had on the tail end of this final, well, not final, but a later failed attack by an all-female cell in Paris against Notre Dame. And so this was this contributed and kind of completed that moment of reckoning in France, which is why I call this the reactivity period, regarding, okay, well, it's not just that we need to rethink how we're dealing with Daesh members, but also how we're dealing with women engaged with this group, and more broadly with political violence. So yes, this was it was this reactivity period in which, okay, it was seeking to understand who are these women, and to see to understand what their status and roles were, and so how much of a security threat they might be understood to pose. And so it was at this time that that women started to be systematically investigated upon their returns from Syria, and this should be put within the context of, you know, those women during that invisibility phase, those that returned at that time. They may well have been coerced, or may well have not understood exactly that it wasn't humanitarian aid that was taking place in Syria, but something very different. But in that next phase, you have a real change of profiles, because you have women that stayed on for a longer time, that were more engaged. And so these women became to be systematically prosecuted, but first only in the correctional tribunal in France, which means the minor crimes. So it was in relation to their children, or religious goal, or financial support for Daesh and its members. But this also, again, it started to develop as more understanding was made. And now the approach in France now is that, well, actually, even if most of these women may have been in a domestic position, or taken on a domestic role in the domestic sphere, that this was contributing to a broader project, of civilizational projects, quote unquote, of Daesh. So they were providing essential support, and they should be treated as such. That's been the thinking. And so so these women came to be progressively tried with AMT in the Cour d'assises spécialement composée, in the special assize court. And so now, based on this this repatriation shift and the new phase, I've called it a new phase because these are now, we're starting to try those women that stayed on until the end, who have different profiles, and we're coming now with the base of jurisprudence that has been, you know, characterized by increasingly heavy sentencing to deal with these women. So we'll see what this phase looks like, but that's where we are now. Now, in terms of the judicial strategy towards women, these are my research observations to date, but there are challenges relating to evidence, in terms of evidence collection, again, in this domestic sphere, regarding these women's roles. But what we can see now is there's increasing framing of these women as more than victims, but less than combatants. So you have some women that are now receiving sentences that are without having joined a Kadibat or any kind of you know, armed militia within Daesh. You have women that are receiving lengthy sentences that are on par with those that with male combatants. So it's there's an evolution there, but also regarding this particular evidence issue, calling it making the private public, which is effectively what you're seeing as a criminalization of the domestic sphere, because traditionally the private sphere, the domestic sphere, that space is for the home, for the family, for the children, and in terms of traditional patriarchal values, is where women are constrained to. And what you're seeing is that, because, again, this understanding of that domestic role and position as something that's fundamentally contributing to the ideology and the carrying out of Daesh's ideal, there and because of a lack of clear evidence for many women going into this space, you're seeing a move towards criminalizing those acts in that sphere that up to now have been staunchly private in almost all contexts. So it's new, and I think it's leaves some space for reflection. And finally, the instrumentalization of gender in court. Rather than implicit biases in terms of, or stereotypes relating to gender that you might expect, and that were present up to until recently, you're seeing on one hand the prosecutor's office, which is coming with the perspective of, well, we were sexist until now, and now we are giving women their full dues in terms of accountability, in terms of being a member of society, and so being responsible fully for their acts. So it presents as a feminist viewpoint, but it's also quite a security heavy viewpoint. And at the same time, in the defensive strategies and postures, you're still seeing very much an emphasis on the women's victimhood, on their submissive status, on their roles as mothers or others. So it's you're really seeing an instrumentalization of those gender norms and ideas in court. And this has implications. So this is something that both that Sofia discusses in her paper with regard to the prosecution of these core international crimes versus the use of the AMT law, and that Sharon also discussed here in terms of preventive justice. Because there's such a focus now still, and this may change regarding the evolution that Sofia was talking about, but because there's such a focus still on the use of the AMT law in court rather than the use of these core international crimes, what you see is a security forward rather than an accountability forward approach, which is to say that the priority is to get people detained, to get and keep people in jail for as long as possible, as opposed to have them be held accountable for individual crimes, war crimes that they may have committed, because these are harder to prove. There's a higher burden of evidence, and it seems up to now, at least, that the priority in France is not accountability, but it is the security approach. And this approach also has implications regarding European cooperation, because these women in the camps, they speak to each other. And they know that, well, when in one country they're going to get a certain kind of treatment, and another country, in France has one of the heaviest sentencing policies in Europe, so there, when you have a fraction of the sentence for the same charges that are being carried out in other European countries, well, this and it's known amongst these women that are returning. This has implications for your disengagement projects and for the person's relationship to the state. Okay, and so the last point, and this is regarding les cas lourds that Sofia discusses, and again, this question of repatriation. Those remaining don't want to come back. It doesn't mean that they're not a security issue, or the other constraints or considerations that come into play for them are not present. In fact, they may be even more so. So having a coherent European policy, and certainly a very considered French policy of how this will happen, is extremely important. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much.